Hi, this is Wendy Dumlao from the Law Office of Wendy Dumlao. I'm doing a presentation today on parent participation in IEPs and the rules related to COVID. So there's been quite a few changes that have happened related to the IEP process, and then some new laws that came out, specifically SB 98. A little background about me. I am an attorney and I have been one for almost 14 years. I do advocacy related to regional center services. I will help with Medi-Cal issues like IHSS. I also do advocacy related to Social Security disability benefits or supplemental security income. And I do special education. We're going to go over the basics of parent participation in the IEP process, and we'll discuss what an IEP is, the important components of an IEP, what parents' rights are if they don't agree with the IEP, and then we'll talk about COVID and how that's affected some of the IDEA rules. Okay, so the basics. One of the most important things is the more you know, the more you can be involved. And so with that said, having knowledge of your basic rights under IDEA or California special education law is really important. I think that for parents, it will help you feel more confident when advocating for your child at these meetings. So one of the things you can do is if you don't understand something when you're at a meeting, you should ask the educators to explain it. A lot of times they'll be going through assessments and it will not make sense. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to me, and I'm a lawyer. So if you don't understand, just ask them to explain. It is their obligation to explain to you what all of it means. And again, you can't participate fully if you don't understand what the team is discussing. I have a little checklist here. This is not an exhaustive list, so there are many rights that parents and students have under IDEA, but these are some of the big ones. And so your child has a right to be evaluated at public expense to determine eligibility for special education. So if you believe your child has a disability that would require services in the school setting, then all you have to do is ask for them to be assessed for special education. If they are found eligible for special education, they have a right to an IEP, which is an individualized education program. And that will provide specialized instruction, and it will be determined based off assessments and what the team knows about the student. And it will also, usually it has related services, which we'll talk about what those are. Both of these things are combined to allow the student to make educational progress. One of the most important things to remember is this should be at no cost to the parent. So if a team determines that a student needs tutoring, the parent doesn't need to pay for that tutoring, the school team needs to pay for that tutoring. Another one of the entitlements is the student's right to be educated to the maximum extent possible with typically developing peers. So all that means, and you may have heard this term, but that just means they have a right to be educated in the least restrictive environment. And so what that looks like for each student is going to be different depending on their needs. But there's an overarching rule that students with disabilities should not be separated from general education peers unless that has to happen for them to make progress. You also have right to access to the maximum extent possible general curriculum. So and we'll get into the placement discussion and what all of those placements look like, but a student has a right to be receiving the general curriculum, the state standard curriculum, even if they require special education. One of the most important rules I always think is the parent's right to be involved in the decision-making process and in developing the IEP. So parents are team members, and IDEA supports that. Their input is important. Usually they're the ones that know the child the best. They may not know the special education laws, but they do know that child the best. And then you have some procedural safeguards, which are a right to a due process hearing if there's a disagreement. I always suggest trying to work it out with the team because they're going to be your team for a long time. But sometimes things need to be decided by a judge, and that you would have a right to file for due process, and that will end up in a hearing. You also have a right, there's some additional rights you have. There's compliance complaints and some other types of complaints that can be filed. We're not going to really talk about that in this session, but if you go to California Department of Ed's website, it will tell you what your procedural safeguards are and the types of complaints that you can file. Okay, so another term you'll hear quite a bit is FAPE. And this is IDEA's definition, which is free and appropriate public education. So we'll break that down a little bit. Basically, a FAPE is special education and related services, which again, I'll tell you what a related services is in a second, that are available to an eligible child at no cost to the parent or guardian, meets the state educational standards, and conforms to the child's IEP. So there's a lot there, but again, no cost to the parent. It should meet state curriculum, even if it's special education, and whatever they are providing needs to be in line with what the IEP says. And we'll go through some components of an IEP a little bit later. So special education is instruction specifically designed to meet the unique needs of the child with a disability. A lot of times the way they determine that, they don't just guess, they do a bunch of assessments to determine where the child is, what age level they're at in their education. And so then sometimes they might be a few grade levels behind in math. So there'll be some goals and things and some instruction related to math to try to so they make progress, but also to try to get them back to grade level standard. Related services are the other piece, which is things like transportation, developmental, corrective, and supportive services that are required to assist the child in benefiting from their special education. So these are going to be additional services that are put in place, maybe from some other deficits. So if somebody has a language delay, they would want a related service they could be entitled to would be speech services. So it really, again, it's all dependent on that child and their individual needs. And sometimes you don't know what those are until they're assessed. And then sometimes you don't agree with the school assessments, and so you need to go out and get your own assessments. But all of this stuff combined is what's going to help figure out what the IEP should look like. So here's another list. This is related services. It's not exhaustive. There are many, many, many related services, but these are just some common ones. Transportation, speech and language services, physical therapy, occupational therapy, behavior supports. That would look like maybe an aide in the classroom, providing behavior modification support so that the student could access general education. Music therapy, psychological services or counseling, which is typically done by the school counselor, and then social skills. A lot of times you see social skills for kids with autism. So again, not an exhaustive list. It really depends on what the student needs. Some of the placement options that exist are, this is from the least restrictive to the most restrictive. So general education classroom, what that would look like if you have an IEP is that you may have accommodations or modifications to the curriculum, but you're full-time in the general education classroom. And there is the potential that the person isn't doing grade level work, but a lot of times it's a team decision, including the parents, that that student be in the general education classroom, regardless of the fact that they're not at the same level curriculum-wise. The next option, which is a little bit more restrictive, is general education classroom with specialized academic instruction. So that is instruction provided by a special education teacher. So that could be a resource specialist teacher, or it could be a teacher with a credential to help students with disabilities, like cognitive disabilities. And this can look different depending on what the team wants. It could be general education part of the day, specialized academic instruction in a different classroom, which is just special needs students. It could be general education all of the day with a teacher pushing in and working on goals with the student. Or it could be general education most of the day and pull out with a resource specialist teacher just working on goals. So they're not in a special education class, they're working like one-on-one basically to try to get the person back to grade level curriculum. So there's lots of placement options that include general education. Sometimes families want their students in a special education classroom full-time, and that's their decision. I do believe that some interaction with general education peers is important. It's important for modeling. It's important for like social emotional benefit comes from it. So special education classroom full day, I usually try to at least educate about what else could happen in general education, but ultimately placement decisions, it's what the family's comfortable with. The school district will tell you it's ultimately their decision. And again, if you don't agree with that, you can file for due process. So the next one, which is more restrictive, is a special classroom with or without alternative curriculum. So sometimes you're in a special education classroom and it's a mild or moderate that they're in, and there's specific state level curriculum they're working on, even if it's just modified and a little bit slower. Then there's an alternative curriculum where somebody might be in 6th grade, but they're working on kindergarten level reading because that's just where they're at. So that would be an alternative curriculum. So the next most restrictive, even though it's sometimes the most appropriate, would be a non-public school. So these are private schools where they're pretty expensive. Sometimes the district funds them, sometimes parents place there and pay for it themselves. But they're mostly special education students. And so the only issue with a non-public school, again, it might be the most appropriate, but the only issue with that is that you wouldn't have access to general education peers. Home hospital is a temporary placement, and it's usually because there's something medically going on. It could also be because there's an emotional issue that has occurred and it's difficult for the student to attend a regular school setting. So home hospital is less instruction, it happens in the home. You do still get your related services, but mostly all of the instructors and related service providers come into the home to provide the services. And other is could be things like residential. Sometimes students have a pretty significant emotional disability and they require residential placement, which is where you go somewhere else for school and you live there. But I put other because there's all types of placement options that you can come up with for that student. Again, it's individualized, so you have to be looking at how are they going to make a benefit from where they're placed, and are they getting access to general education peers, which I think is very important. Okay, so FAPE review, this is just a little bit about the case law that applies, and you could Google Andrew or Rowley. You could Google special education Andrew case and it will give you sort of a synopsis. So it's pretty easy to find if you wanted to see what the case was about. Our standard that we used to follow, and we still do, was from the Rowley case. It basically said what a FAPE was. Like, what does it take to say somebody has received FAPE, right? Because it's individualized. So we have to have some parameters around how we judge whether the school district provided FAPE or not. So the Rowley standard said that for a district to meet its substantive obligation under IDEA, they must offer an IEP that is reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. So what does that mean, right? So they're looking at a few things. First of all, did the IEP that the school team came up with and proposed to the family, was it calculated enough for that person to make progress? Well, what is progress? Well, it depends. So in Rowley, progress, you could just make, average amount of progress. There was no high standard of how much progress you had to make to be getting a FAPE. In the Andrew case, it clarified the Rowley standard. It didn't change the standard, which I think is really important for people to understand. Andrew didn't come out and say, the court didn't say like, oh, we're not following the Rowley standard anymore. That's not what happened. It did clarify it a bit. What it said, which I think is super important, is that every child should have the chance to meet challenging objectives. So when you're thinking about, do I think my child could meet that annual goal? If the answer is maybe, but I don't know, then it would probably be important for that to be a goal, right? Because we want them to be challenged. We're not going to just make it easy for them. If we are trying to have them make the same amount of progress or get the same education as students without disabilities, then we need to challenge them. So I think, again, the standard is average progress. It didn't increase the standard on what progress looks like, but it did look at a couple things. It should be challenging. So a lot of advocates have started pushing for that even more. But also there was a discussion about students who were in general education, or maybe even not in general education, but that they should be receiving and the district should be attempting to have them make the same progress in their general curriculum as students without disabilities. So we should still be working off of state curriculum, and the district should be trying to ensure that they meet those objectives just like students without IEPs. And I know that's difficult. That's probably a big thing to ask. But I think it's really important that students with disabilities are pushed educationally, just like students without disabilities. So each child's IEP has to include a few things. And if you look at the different IEPs throughout the district, like in San Diego, we have multiple school districts. So if you look at all the formats, they're a little different, but there are specific things that have to be in each IEP that are required by law. And the way it looks, the courts and the judges haven't said that there has to be a specific format. They just say that it has to make sense to the parents, right? So they can participate, and that there's some things that have to be included. So among other information, there has to be an accurate statement of the child's present levels. That is probably the most important piece to spend the most amount of time on when in the IEP process. And if anyone's been to an IEP, they're very long, and you can have a couple of them. But what's important about that piece is that your goals are built off of that, right? Your areas of need are built off of the present levels. Your related services might be built off the present levels. So, and the progress you've made. It should say the progress you've made in those areas. So present levels are really important, and it's one of the very first things that are discussed in an IEP meeting. So present levels also should look at academic achievement, so where you're at academically, reading, math, all of those areas, and then it's going to look at your functional performance. What is your language like? What's your social emotional abilities, right? When you get older, they look at vocational, they look at your adaptive living skills. That's your functional performance. And so those are areas under present levels as well. Then they're supposed to develop annual goals, and these should be based off of your area of need. So if you have deficits in certain areas, your goals should relate to that. And then every year, as you make progress on those goals, you're supposed to build off of that. They also have to explain how they're going to report progress. So a lot of times you'll see on an IEP, it says like quarterly, or when the general education peers get their report card, they're supposed to be sending grade reports for that grade, but also progress reports. They're supposed to be sending them home. And then obviously if you have questions, you should ask those. I actually advise, and we'll get into this, but I advise that parents ask for all the work samples so they can see what their child is doing. And sometimes you get the progress report and you think, that's not what I'm seeing. So it's sometimes important to ask for those documents. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, like some practice tips that I have. Okay, so parent participation laws, again, a huge cornerstone to IDEA is parent participation. So each public agency must take steps to ensure that one or both of the parents of a child with a disability are present at the IEP and that they're afforded the opportunity to participate. So the district should be notifying the parents early enough for them to have an opportunity to attend. If the meeting doesn't work for them, they need to find one that's mutually agreeable for the parents and the team. I think, you know, the schools have gotten pretty good about doing that and being flexible, but I still see sometimes, I mean, it like blows my mind, but I still see times where a family will call me and say, we couldn't make the meeting, so they held it without us. They should not be doing that. That is a huge procedural violation. And the school team should not be doing that unless they have tried multiple times to get the parents to come to an IEP meeting. The parents say they're going to attend, they don't show up, they don't call, then yes, at some point they have to hold the IEP meeting. But it's 99% of the time they should be trying to find a date and time that works for the parents. So information that should be provided to the parents, the notice required has to have the purpose on it. So it should say why there's an IEP meeting. Are we reviewing annual goals? Or is it a parent requested IEP meeting? It should have the time and the location of the meeting and who will be there. It has to inform parents of the participants, which includes others who have special knowledge, maybe transition service providers, which we'll talk about transition. That doesn't start until 16, but we'll have a little bit of a discussion about it. So anybody who's important to that IEP should be on there. Sometimes you're having an IEP and the OT person can't come, right? Or they can only be there for the first hour. What is required is that the team asks the parents if they can be excused from the rest of the meeting, and if the parents are in agreement, there's a form that has to be signed. But there should always be every participant at the meeting, which includes a special education teacher and a general education teacher, and then all the service providers, the parents, and anybody the parents want to bring, whether it's an attorney, a friend, whoever. They have a right to bring who they want to an IEP meeting. As we discussed, they should not hold the meeting unless they have detailed, without you, unless they have detailed records that they've tried to convince you to attend. They need to provide translation or interpretation whenever necessary, but you have to give them notice of it. They can't just guess, but they need to provide that, and they should also be translating the IEP for the parents. They need to provide a copy of the IEP to the parents. So we will get into this, like my practice tips for an IEP, but one of the things that I find really important, because there's multiple versions of IEPs that go around. You get the first one usually emailed to you, it's a draft, then you get one at the meeting, and then there's one after the meeting. I always, if I'm saving it on my computer, I put the date I received it, because it helps you later when you're looking through all the drafts to know exactly at what point you got these drafts, right? Because if you just save it as IEP, annual IEP, you're not gonna be able to figure out which one was which. Or if I'm printing them, in the right-hand corner, I write the date and how I got it. So if it was emailed, but I printed it, I put the date I got it, and then I put by email. If I show up to a meeting, which we're not doing a lot of those right now, but if I show up to an IEP meeting and I'm given a draft, I immediately write received at IEP meeting on such and such date. It just helps me keep track. So that's a practice tip to keep things organized. Be an active participant. So how do you do that, right? Here's some of my practice tips. This is what I do to prepare, and I think parents could absolutely do this in advance. So when there's an IEP meeting, I always say at least 3 days in advance of the meeting, you need to do a few things. You need to ask for a draft IEP. You need to ask for any progress reports. You need to ask for any data or work samples related to those goals. And then all the assessment reports if assessments were done. What you don't want to do if a ton of assessments are done is walk into a meeting and listen to people regurgitate the entire assessment. You're not going to know what they just talked about. So what you should be doing is reviewing all of this stuff and writing down your questions. So you went through the speech report, you don't understand what something means, highlight it and write your questions down. That way you can be an active participant. I also, when you're asking for these documents, you can give your notice of recording at that time. You can either give notice of recording on the IEP team notice that you get that you have to sign and return, or you can do it when you ask for all these records. So here's what I just tell parents to say when they're asking for the records. In order for me to be prepared for the meeting, I need the following documents 3 days before our meeting, and then list them. And then say, or I will need to reschedule the meeting. Having these documents in advance will help me fully participate in the meeting, which those are really like the key terms of art, right? These will help me fully participate in the meeting. And then make sure you review everything. If you have questions, call somebody. That it would be a good time for you to call and maybe get advice from an attorney or an advocate, like, hey, they have this in the IEP and I don't understand it, or write your questions down. This should be a team process. Sometimes it gets a little contentious, but it should start out as a team process. And so any questions you have should be answered by the team when you ask them. Sometimes they can't give you an answer, like you request a service and they'll send you their answer in writing, which is called prior written notice. But always record your IEPs and always ask all the questions that you have during those meetings so they can get you answers. So I just did like a little breakdown of what to be an active participant, what you need to do. Always ask questions. Make them explain it in terms that you understand. Do not feel embarrassed that you don't understand. Like I said at the beginning, I'm a lawyer and there are times that I don't understand what they're talking about. So make them explain it to you in terms you understand. Always record your meeting. Always review the notes section after the meeting. So after the meeting, they should be sending you a notes section of what occurred at the meeting. Not every IEP team or not every school district does team notes, but you can be doing your own, and I always do them for my client. So I always take notes as we're going through the process because sometimes the notes pages are very general and there might have been something a parent said that I think is important or the parent thinks is important that didn't end up in the notes. And so then the parents can attach their own notes page. I know for San Diego Unified, they do a team action page and they put all the important pieces there, but they don't do IEP notes and it's not required. I think it's a good practice, but it's not required. So that's why I have here, always review the notes or team action page. And then I don't know, LA Unified and some of the other districts further out probably do other things. Never sign your IEP until you review the document at home where there's no pressure. So they ask you sometimes to sign in participation and you can absolutely do that. Some parents write next to their name in participation only. If you feel nervous, go ahead and do that. The team doesn't care. Or you just sign in participation and that's it. There's a line that you can sign on. But I always say take time to review it. If you want advice from somebody, take it home. I think the teams know that there's a lot of parents who are advised to take it home and look at it so they don't throw a fit. And to be honest, if they get upset about it, it's too bad. It's your right under IDEA. So you do not have to sign until you've reviewed it and fully understand it. I think one of the things I don't go into, that's scheduling the IEP. So one of the things that I don't talk about in this presentation, so I'll just bring it up now, is how do you sign an IEP? Well, there's multiple ways you can sign an IEP. You can sign fully in agreement. You can sign with exception, which means I agree to all parts of this IEP except I think my child needs more speech services, but I'll let you implement speech, but I don't agree that that is FAPE, right? So you can write your concerns, you can write your exception to what you're agreeing to. Sometimes you say, I agree to everything except placement. And that becomes a big deal because it usually will end up in a hearing, but that's okay if you've got a lot of evidence and proof that the placement that student's in is not what's appropriate. So there's all sorts of ways to sign. If the district team tells you or the school team tells you you have to sign an agreement or they can't implement it, that's not true. You can sign with exception. So scheduling the IEP, if a parent requests an IEP, they have to hold it within 30 days of your request, unless you're close to the end of the school year. So if you're 30 days out from the end of the school year, let's say you ask 29 days from the end of the school year, they do not have to hold your IEP until 30 days after the school year begins the next year. So if you really want to get something handled before the end of the school year, you should be requesting your IEPs at least a month and a half out from the end of the school year, just to give you time to do that. Never let them convene an IEP without you. So if they say to you, oh, you know, we're just going to bump up the speech services, so we'll do the meeting without you, I don't recommend that. There could be things that get changed that you have no idea about. There are times when there's a lawyer involved or an advocate and they want to do an addendum to the IEP, and so the attorneys sort of work on the language together. Those are appropriate times to not be a part of an IEP. But I highly recommend you be involved in the meeting if they're going to change anything. Even if it's changing something for your benefit, you should be involved, or you should have an attorney involved to look at it. It's a pretty long document, and sometimes things get changed just from being in the computer system and trying to change something else. It's not always an intentional change, but once you sign, that's your stay put. So you just got to be really careful. You can request a meeting at any time and they have to hold it. The problem is if you're close to the end of the school year, they don't. And then always give notice of recording. If you want to record your IEP meetings, you have to give them 24 hours notice. There are times the district will just let you record if you don't, but they don't like to because they want to record and they want to be prepared to record. So you need to give them notice. And I know a lot of parents ask, like, do we have to tell them a lawyer's coming? You don't have to, but you have to remember that this process is supposed to be a team process, and you don't want to walk in with a lawyer and not have shared that with them, because it really could put them on the defense, which then doesn't make the process a team process anymore, right? They're waiting to see what the attorney is going to do or say. So I always give notice if I'm attending an IEP. The district has a right to have their counsel there if you have yours. So I just say give notice if you're bringing an advocate or attorney. We talked about this a little bit. Know your child's IEP. So you want to know every section of the IEP. And I don't have samples of an entire IEP, but I have a few samples. I have a services page. I have a transition plan. If your child has an IEP, and during our question session, you guys can go through those parts with me. I will, if there's anything anybody wants to email to me so that I can look at it, I will talk with Hope on the Hard Road for that also, how we do that, how we share those documents. But we will go through the services page after I tell you about it. So these are your related services, and it's going to outline things like your speech services, OT services, if somebody has a one-to-one aide, all of those services you're getting in addition to special education. One of the things I always do before an annual IEP is I compare the services page from what was agreed upon last year. So I always make sure I understand what the parent agreed to, and then I compare them to make sure whatever they're offering is the same as what, at least the same as what the child was getting the year before. And if there's a reduction, I'm going to want to know why they're reducing the services. Sometimes services are reduced and it's not intentional. Like I said, you go into the computer, you're making other edits, somehow something gets unclicked and it gets changed. So it's just really important to always double check. And sometimes they change it on purpose and don't tell you. So just always double check your services. If you think a service should be increased or decreased, ask for it, but be able to explain why. Did you have an outside assessment done? Does the student go to speech services privately and you've determined that they've made so much progress they don't need it anymore? Or has there been a regression in speech and you think the school needs to be picking up and doing some more speech services? Just be prepared to explain why. You don't want to ask for something and say, well, I don't know why, I just feel like he needs more speech. So we talked about present levels. That's another important piece to the IEP. Helps drive the goals. Judges do look at these. They want to know what was determined as the present levels. They need to be accurate every year. It's really hard to develop an IEP with present levels that aren't accurate. The goals are going to be off, the deficits and needs are going to be off. You're not going to really know how much of each related service you're going to need. So if you don't agree with the present levels, tell them to put your input in, right? So what would an example be? Let's talk about reading. Let's say the school team believes, your child's in 2nd grade, the school team believes they're reading at a 1.5 grade level, okay? And you say, nope, that's not accurate. I've done reading at home with my child. She's reading below kindergarten level. She's not getting it. She's not decoding the words. She's not understanding what she's reading. I'm having to help. Your input, if they put that they believe that, they should also put that you have reported that at home, she reads lower than a kindergarten level. Because you're part of the team. And a lot of times they don't want to do that, but I push for it. And ultimately, if they don't, then you make sure you do your own notes page and you put each present level that you don't agree with, because you want it documented. I don't know why a district would say a student's doing better than they are, but sometimes it happens. Any current testing that's been done should go under present levels as well. So if there was like a reading assessment that was done that they shared with you to show you this, that should be, they should list what reading assessment they did and when they did it and what the results were. The areas of concern are developed from present levels, which we talked about. And like I just said, ask them to put your input in if your opinion is different than theirs. Before we go on, I want to look at a services page. So this, since we were talking about services pages, this is a service page. The top, it usually says services or offer a FAPE, but I redacted it because it had student information. So I didn't want to, for confidentiality reasons, I took it off. But this is what a services page will look like. This is actually a San Diego Unified one, and I think their IEP format has changed a bit recently. But it starts here, then it outlines your special education services. So you'll see where it says special education services, there's primary services, which would be specialized academic instruction. We talked about that. If you look over to the right, it says environment, and below that it says regular classroom. So this is where somebody is getting push-in specialized academic instruction, meaning they're in the regular classroom and a special education teacher is coming in 4 hours per week to provide some push-in support. And then if you go here, there's the one below it, there's specialized academic instruction, and this is in a separate classroom. So this tells you the person is getting 15 hours a week in a special day class is what we call it, or a separate classroom. And then they're getting about 4 hours a week in general education. So they sort of have a split. It looks like they're spending a lot more time in special education, but they are getting some general education time. And then if you go down a bit, the related services are laid out next. So we have occupational therapy, It says they're getting 8 hours a year, which is not a lot. It's like once a month, basically. And in a separate classroom, that means that they're just getting it probably in the OT room. It also could mean that it's push-in in the special ed classroom. It's kind of unclear, and sometimes you have them identify that in the notes section. Language and speech services, this person gets 28 hours a year. Any other location or setting, so that's probably in the speech room. Music therapy, 10 hours, separate classroom. Yeah, that's probably push-in into the special ed class. And then psychological services, which are really, it's not like psychologically there's issues. It means counseling services, basically. Sometimes students with autism have some emotional needs, and so or sensory or issues like peer issues, and so they get some counseling services to be able to work through those. And so again, any other location, this is probably happening in the counseling room or in the office or something. And if you go down, it'll tell you how many instructional minutes there are and how many of those are in special education and how many are in general education. So it actually does look like this person has almost a 50-50 split. So that just means, so when you're looking at the instructional minutes versus the SAI that was above, it's saying that of the 45% of the time this person's in general ed, they're going to get 4 hours of SAI. So essentially, part of the time they're in general ed, they're getting nothing. They're just in general education with their peers, and they're able to do that based off their needs. It looks like in this district, they do what the least restrictive environment is, which just means where this person is placed, and they have regular classroom. So this person is gen ed, but some pull out to special ed. And then if we go down a little more, so this is the present levels we were talking about. I didn't actually know I saved this, so I'm glad this is on here. For San Diego Unified, this is what their present levels page looks like. And it has like strengths and interests first, and most of the IEPs have that. Then it has parent concerns, this little tiny box, and a lot of times it's not enough space, so I just have parents draft up a Word document with their concerns, and I help them get that ready to attach to the IEP. But then it goes into all of these sections, which are present level. So academic readiness skills, and the first one is reading. So we'll talk about where the person is in their reading, if they're at age level curriculum, and then what goals they worked on or what areas of reading they need to work on. Is it reading fluency, which means how fast they can read words, or is it reading comprehension? Are they understanding what they're reading? Obviously, there are lots of pieces to reading, and it's not just comprehension and fluency, but those are just some examples. They'll do the reading present levels. Here, somebody had an assessment done, and so they put all of the results from the assessment in here under reading present levels. And then motor skills, they look at motor skills. They talk about if it's an area of concern or not. So on San Diego Unified's form, they give you the present level, and then they say whether it's an area of concern or not. If this is checked, it's an area of concern, then you should have an IEP goal related to that area of concern. So this is why this section is so important. Social emotional, here it's an area of concern. So there's going to be a goal related to cope with non-preferred or unexpected activities and situations. That's going to be goal number 3 for this student. So here's all the present levels. Here's where this is an annual goal. We might as well look at all of these pieces since I have it. The area of need is a reading goal. It has when the goal will start, when the goal will end, who is responsible for the goal. It will say what goal it is. It'll give you the baseline percentage, and that's usually built off of an assessment. So this person's been assessed in their reading, and they're 40% accurate. So basically basically for this goal, they want the student to decode 100 regularly spelled CVC words with 80% accuracy. This person's baseline is 40. So they've got 40% to go before the end of the year or before the end of this annual goal. And if you look at the baseline, this person is starting with 40 sight words. That's why they're at 40%. Oh, this is a behavior plan. So this student needed a behavior plan. I believe it was a student with autism, and he had some pretty significant behavioral issues. There were tantrums, refusals, and the reason this plan is developed is because his behaviors that are related to his disability, he cannot help them. He needs to be taught how to find a different replacement behavior that's more socially appropriate, right? So that he can attend to whatever task he's doing. So this behavior plan is to teach that, but also to monitor the progress on how they're teaching a replacement behavior, so that when you look back, you say, at the end of the year, or maybe 6 months in, you say, you know, this plan that we developed is not working. This student is not making progress. In fact, the behaviors have increased, so we need to come back to the drawing board and figure something else out. But a lot of times these are developed because the student with the behaviors are not accessing their education, because the staff working with them are spending so much time trying to modify the behavior that they're missing all of the instruction. So the real purpose of these is to not only make progress and teach a replacement behavior, but also to determine if the plan they're using is working or not. So this will tell you, this is a pretty good behavior plan. It talks about what the behaviors are quite in detail, talks about the frequency of them, the intensity of them, how long they last, who's gonna report to parents the progress, and then there's a whole plan that's outlined below. So when I get to the slide about behavior intervention plans, this is what I'm talking about. Here's the alternatives they're supposed to be teaching. So there's always a section on the replacement behavior. What are we going to teach the student instead? So if somebody's tantruming because they don't like to do a non-preferred activity, but unfortunately, being a part of school and learning, you have to do some non-preferred activities. They're going to teach, has difficulty expressing his wants and needs in appropriate ways, trying to get out of a non-preferred activity or gain attention. So they're probably going to teach communication skills, right? They're going to teach what's the most appropriate way to say you don't want to do this activity anymore. And a lot of times what they'll do is they'll teach that, and then they'll say, they'll let the person out of the activity to show them that if they use the appropriate way to say, I don't want to do this anymore, it positively reinforces them doing that replacement behavior instead of the tantruming or screaming profanities. This is the rest of the behavior plan. Here's the functionally equivalent replacement behavior. So yeah, they're gonna do visual, class, and personal schedule for this student, so the person knows what's coming. First, then model and role play different scenarios at baseline. Practice zones and self-calming strategies. So this person's supposed to identify what zone they're in. Oh, this is the team action page that we were talking about that San Diego Unified has. And in fact, I do think this form has changed a little, but it still has all of this stuff. So they're going to list the topics that they need to meet again about. They're going to list any additional assessments that were discussed, any referrals or any additional items. Here's where they're going to plug in maybe parent concerns. Maybe the parents agree to the IEP, but they don't agree the speech services are enough. So they're going to put that there. And then it has who's the responsible party to follow up on it. Then this is their consent page as well. So they have parent consents to the following portions of the IEP, and they actually lay out each portion. So you can check mark what you agree to and what you don't. There's a transportation piece, and then any prior written notices that they've given. So let's say you request an assessment by an outside behavior agency, and if they issued a prior written notice saying, no, we want to assess first, they would put that here. And here's the remainder of the signature page. So here's that consent portion we talked about. I consent to the IEP, or I consent to portions of the IEP. And you don't even, right here is where you can also just check what you want, but then write a statement about what you don't agree to, like specific statement, even if it's not captured here. Okay, so we'll continue to talk about the components of an IEP. I just wanted to show you some of those samples. And remember, if your format of your child's IEP doesn't look like that, that's okay, as long as it has these important components. Does not have to visually look like that. So IEP goals, the things to remember about the goals are they need to be measurable. And what does that mean, right? Well, it means it needs to say what they're going to accomplish in specificity. Like what percentage of that goal are they going to complete? How many trials of that goal are they going to do throughout the reporting period? And if it's a reading goal, what level is this person going to be reading at? The annual goals, even though objectives are no longer required, legally, a lot of school districts still do those because they realize it's a good way to track how that person's doing on that goal. Sometimes you won't see objectives for certain goals, but you will for other ones, and it's because the team might be concerned it's a lofty goal, meaning they don't think the person's going to meet it. So at progress reporting time, they want to see how they're doing because they might need to tweak the goal. So they should always be measurable. And if you don't understand how they're measuring the progress, you need to ask them to explain it. There should always be a person responsible for the goal. That doesn't necessarily mean, if it says special education teacher, that it has to be done in the special education setting. But you do need to pay attention to who was made responsible for the goal and why they were made responsible for the goal. A student and a parent should never be responsible for a goal. This is the person who's tracking it. I do understand why some districts put student on the transition goal because they want them to be responsible, but there's no legal requirement that they be responsible for the goal. So if the parents don't care, I just leave it. But technically and legally, there's no need for it. It should be whoever the educator is, that's who's responsible for the goal. It should address the areas of concern. So there should always be a goal for every area of concern. And then under the Andrew case, they should be challenging. So if you think that a goal is not challenging enough, speak up and tell them why and have them make it more challenging. And they might push back, but you still have a right to your opinion. So this is the transition plan I was talking about. At 16 years old, the districts have to start developing these, and there's a couple pieces to them. So number one, they should be based off assessments and not just some survey that was done with the student. There should be real transition assessments that are done. And maybe assessments of their academic achievement, right? Because if you're going to be working somewhere doing a cash register, you're going to have to understand money. And if you don't have that skill yet, that's not going to be a position that you're going to be eligible for. So maybe that is one of the goals that needs to be worked on. And if it needs to be a functional goal, fine. But it still needs to be potentially an area of need, which is turned into a goal. So there should be assessments. There can be surveys of what the student wants or of what the parents think the student wants. It's not a good excuse if a district says we can't assess because they have a cognitive disability and they're nonverbal. There are plenty of assessments that take into consideration students with significant cognitive disabilities. It might be difficult to understand what they're selecting, but they should still be assessed in those formats, not just some survey done by the parent. Again, it should be individualized to that student's post-secondary aspirations. And when I show you the sample of this transition plan, I'm going to show you the parts that are usually not filled in very much, and they should be. There should be lists of what they're going to do to accomplish these transition goals. not just they'll take part in the special education program. Like, that's not good enough. Otherwise, when they're 22 or 18 or 19 and they transition out, they're not going to have the skills they need to leave the education setting into their community and potentially have a competitive employment or even a part-time job. So there's a lot of skills that need to be worked on, and that's why it has to start at 16. Let's see. Oh, transition goals. So they should change every year. There are overarching goals. There's one in training and education. There's one in employment, and then there's one under independent living. So then you determine what you want under those categories. It should list the services that are going to be provided to ensure you meet those goals. And it should list community experiences and activities that will be completed. These last two sections, the list of services, the list of community experiences and activities, that's what I was talking about when I said there needs to be a list and not just like a sentence about how they're going to do it. There's a lot that should go into those. Okay, so this is a sample transition plan, but these are those three sections that you should have goals in. So there's post-secondary goal training or education. There is this one, which is post-secondary goal employment. And then there's post-secondary goal independent living. And I'm going to go through each of these sections with you. But first, let's look at some of these questions. Was a student invited to the IEP? The student has to always be invited after age 16. It doesn't mean they have to attend, because some parents don't want them to attend and have to listen to everybody talk about their deficits, so that makes sense. But they have to be invited at least. Then it talks about how they'll participate in the process. This one, they did some interest inventories, interview, and this student was present at the meeting. Here's the part about assessment. So these interest inventories are these surveys I was talking about. These are not enough, or this questionnaire, it's not enough. But if you look at this part, it says age-appropriate transition assessments and instruments were used. Yes, so this district did do some transition assessments, which are more formal. And then it says describe the results. I had to redact this out because there was too much confidential information, but this is where it should say what assessments were done and what the results were of those assessments. So with this first goal, this is what your transition goal should look like. We spent probably 3 different meetings getting these goals perfected. So this student, upon completion of school, will continue to explore paid job opportunities and college opportunities in my community and continue to take classes that will assist in job readiness. So this student wanted to have multiple opportunities exploring jobs. They wanted to do any community or volunteer work, and they wanted to take some community college classes that could potentially help them when they graduate to sort of transition to some other area. So what's this box over here to the right talks about the activities that are going to be done to support this post-secondary goal. This needs to be specific or it won't get done. So some of the things that I thought were super important was, first of all, yes, being involved in an adult transition program classes and using the curriculum is important to these goals, but it's not the only piece. So here it says ATP classes with the Stanfield curriculum. That's a pretty good curriculum around transition or transition services. So I'm glad they listed it here, but if it just said that, it wouldn't be enough. So this ATP just means adult transition program. The other thing I asked them to do was jet explorations and a computer class through the community college. So he was taking a computer class, and the jet explorations was him exploring different jobs throughout the school year to see if he liked any of them. They were to assist him in identifying 3 post-secondary programs for students with disabilities The ATP staff will assist this person with applying to a program of interest. And then I made them list some of his community experiences. So he's going to participate in ATP. He's going to do weekly community-based instruction where they go out in the community, JET tours, which was job exploration. He was a part of the SEEDS program, the PEERS program. These are relationships programs, social skills programs, and mobility training. So one of the important things for some of these students is, especially some of the higher functioning kids, is that they need to be taught the skills and they need it done repetitively for it to stick. And to be safe, to be able to travel in the community to your job, you've got to have training on public transportation potentially, right? So that's what mobility training is. It's teaching the person how to safely access their community. And sometimes you do the mobility training and they're still not safe. And that's when then it's documented that they need like private transportation. So this section to me is the most important. I think the goal is important, but having everything that's going to be done listed is super important, because your IEP is a contract. This is what the district and the school team are agreeing to do for this student. So the more you can list, the more specific you can be, the more accountable they will have to be. And so that's done for each one of these. So that's just a sample transition plan. They look different in different IEPs. So we just talked about transition goals and I showed you what those 3 areas look like. Progress is the next important piece to an IEP. IEP teams should use periodic progress reporting and then be informing parents of that. And I think I said this in the beginning, the best way to be an advocate for your child is to know their IEP. So know what the goals are, know what they should be doing 6 months from the development of that goal, and then make them give you the progress reporting and explain to you how they got there. That is their job. I don't think that school teams get upset about that. They know that's a part of their job. If you don't agree with the progress, then always ask for the data or the work samples related to the goal. That way you can see what your child was working on. And you will see differences of what they do or what they can do in a school setting versus at home. It's just a different environment. By the time they get home, they're probably exhausted and don't want to do anything for you. So there could be differences in those settings, how they act, what they're able to do. And that happens a lot. So it doesn't mean the school's not being honest. It just means that they could be putting forth more effort when they're in the school setting. So ask for that documentation. We did talk about behavior plans. I think the best practice is that if someone is going to have a behavior plan, that an FBA be done. That's a functional behavior assessment. And it's not just a review of records. It's not just observation. The person, the behaviorist who's meeting with the student elicits behavior from the student. They do observe them. They do speak to other people, but they also see how a person responds and what the function of the behavior is. So the first thing you need to know in a behavior plan is what's the function of the behavior? Why are they doing this? And then the next big piece is the FERB, or the functional equivalent replacement behavior, which is basically we're going to trade this one behavior, this maladaptive behavior, for this functionally equivalent behavior because it's more socially appropriate. Like instead of throwing the paperwork off the desk because you don't want to do it, you say, no, I don't want to, or I need a break. It should talk about what positive reinforcement is going to be used for that, and how the progress will be measured. So how to track progress. I try to always tell parents how to do this because this is what I do. And if you're doing it yearly instead of getting all of the records and trying to do it at once, it'll just make more sense to you. So I always graph it out. I take the last year's annual and I take what the goal was and I list if they met the goal and what percentage they got. Then I take this year's proposed goal and write it next to it to determine if they met the progress they should have to even be working on this goal. You can also go back 2 years. You can, if you think that your child has had the same goal for 3 years, graph it out. Put what it was, then what it was the next year, then what it was the next year. Put what the percentage was. That way you can sort of see visually, wow, he's mastered the goal every year. Why do we keep working on this? Or he's never met this goal. Why are we still working on this, right? So just graph it out. Take it all and graph it out. And again, if you don't think the progress reports are accurate, request work samples or teacher logs so you can see for yourself. Okay, so here's an example of how it could be graphed out. The annual goal is for the student to be able to complete 10 double-digit addition math problems with 80% accuracy. And see where it says as measured by student work samples? Those are the work samples you're going to request eventually if you don't agree with the progress. And then there's these objective dates. So by 1/20/2016, there should be a percentage they were supposed to reach. By 3/20/2016, there should be a higher percentage they're supposed to meet. By 6/20/2016, it should be even higher. And then by the annual, which is November of 2016, that's where they should be at 80% accuracy. So here, the teacher writes, loses stamina, is able to only complete 5 problems with teacher guidance. So it's not independent, and only 5 are being done instead of 10. And those 5 are only at 50% accuracy. So then when you get to 3/20/2016, you're going to want to know, is the student doing more than 5 problems without teacher guidance? And what percentage is the student at? So that's how you can track this out for yourself. Let me see. Work samples. So there's been like some districts give parents an issue about work samples, and it's super important. Again, you may not know what all of this law even means, but what's important, I'm going to read it to you, but what's important about it is it supports you requesting work samples. So if the district says to you, we don't have to keep work samples, that's not part of his education record. We don't have to give that to you. That's my teacher records. I don't have to give that. That is not accurate. And in fact, the Department of Education says otherwise. So let me read to you what they say, and then I'll explain to you what you say if you get pushback. So the Education Department General Administrative Regulations, which is called EDGAR, and then that gives you the regulation, the citation to the regulation, provides that records required to demonstrate compliance with program requirements must be maintained. So in the case of Part B of IDEA, this requirement would include records demonstrating that all eligible children with disabilities are provided a FAPE, consistent with their IEP. EDGAR, the Ed Department General Administrative Regulations, further states that these records must be retained for 3 years. So these records that are required to show that they've been in compliance would be your work samples. And especially if the IEP goals say as measured by work samples or as measured by teacher observations and notes. So remember, if you want to be able, so there's 2 things here that are important. If you want to be able to track what your child is doing, you've got to make sure the annual goals say how it's going to be measured, right? Is it going to be measured by work samples? Is the teacher going to keep a log? Then, if you don't agree with progress, you can then request those work samples because the law supports that ability. But also your IEP says that's how it's going to be measured. For them to be in compliance, they should have those work samples. They do only have to keep these records for 3 years. So you might just request those work samples every year or two to make sure you're getting all of them before they don't have to be maintained any longer. Let's go through a few of the important timelines that the school districts have to comply with, especially because there was a waiver on assessment timelines when COVID first started, and there was a waiver on getting education records when it first started. Those waivers are no longer in place, which we'll talk about, but these are the timelines, that the typical timelines under IDEA. And they are all now the timelines again, but they had changed at some point. So when you request an assessment from the school district, they have to provide you a prior written notice or the assessment plan within 15 days of your request. Those are calendar days, not business days. If there is a break, if you request it and there's going to be a break of 5 school days or more, they don't have to do it within 15 days. It's when you get back from the school break. If you are 10 or fewer days from the end of school, they don't have to do it until 10 days after school starts again. So this is just related to requesting an assessment. There are timelines for everything, but this is just if you say, I want my child to be assessed in speech. They must hold an IEP meeting. If they do the assessments, they must hold an IEP meeting within 60 days of the signed assessment plan. So the day you sign the plan, they've got 60 days, calendar days, to get all the assessments done and hold an IEP meeting to go over the results. If you don't agree with the assessment results, you can request an IEE. That is an individual, or that's IEE, individual education evaluation. So this basically is a private assessment. You request an IEE, you get to pick who the person is that does it, and you're asking for the school district to pay for it. So you're saying, I don't agree with your speech assessment, so I want an IEE in speech. They have to respond without unreasonable delay. And how they respond is really important. They either have to say yes, or they have to file for due process against you. They can't just say no. That's not an appropriate response legally. And no, you don't want them to file for due process, but they only have 2 options. We call it fund or file. And if they say no, sometimes it's because they do understand their legal obligation, but they don't want to file against you. So they want you to take back your request for an IEE so they don't have to file against you. So there are times they're just trying to work with you, but it's not appropriate for them to just say no, or to say to you, no, and we're going to have to file against you if you don't revoke that request, and then it's up to you. You can revoke it because you don't want to go to due process, or you can say no. You have to pay for it, or you have to file against me. There is a lot of practice tips around requesting IEEs, so I wouldn't suggest doing it without getting advice, because there's some pitfalls and there's some things you can do to set it up correctly for yourself. So you might want to get some advice around that before you do it. Request for records. This was also waived when COVID first happened. It is no longer. They have 5 business days to give you access to the records or provide copies. And if you're going to have an IEP meeting or a resolution session, which is related to a due process hearing, they have to give them to you before that meeting, whether it's 5 days or not. And then another important timeline, again, is your 24-hour notice to record timeline. A few of the complaints, these are under your procedural safeguards. A compliance complaint. This is all done through paper, and it goes to the California Department of Education, and there's investigators assigned, and they investigate the complaint you submitted. You always want to give proof of what you're complaining of. These are only related to the school district not complying with your IEP. These are not if you don't agree to the level of speech services, if you don't agree with placement. That is not what a compliance complaint is for. It's to say you're not complying, basically. And they have 1 year. A person has a year to file from the time you discover they're not complying. So it's a short time period, so be careful. And the compliance complaint, I don't usually advise that. But lately I've heard that there's been a good success rate with compliance complaints related to COVID and the school districts not complying with the IEPs that are in place. So typically, I don't think California Department of Ed does a good job on their compliance complaints, but I've heard that lately since COVID, they've been outstanding. So if you don't want to go to hearing, you might try to do a compliance complaint first. Due process, this is the hearing stage. This is where you file and you request a hearing in front of a judge, and you can go back 2 years. So any of the facts that you found 2 years from when you found out about it, and if the school district concealed any information from you, like they wouldn't give you records, it tolls that timeline. So that, let's say the school district hid records from you 3 years ago, you found out about it, and now it's outside that 2-year timeline, the judges are going to allow for that information to come in because the school district essentially has dirty hands because they concealed information. And then there are discrimination complaints. This is where you believe they're not giving a service to the child because of their disability, or you believe you weren't allowed to be a part of the IEP because of your race or because of the disability or for whatever reason. You have 180 days from the date you discovered the discriminatory acts to file. You would file that complaint with the Office of Civil Rights. And that's it. I'm sure people will have lots of questions, and we will have a question session. I'm also going to make sure this is accessible, and those sample documents I showed you, the services page, and then the other one that started with the individualized transition plan with all those other little pieces to an IEP. That sample with the ITP attached is not necessarily in any order. I just put it together because it has some components I wanted you to see. So yours may not look like that or be in that order. And